you named the time piece. I think patience, like it is like we have to be patient with ourselves and with others when we're asking these questions. So we want to be patient with ourselves because there's a lot of reasons we can be asking these questions at different points in our lives. These questions will bubble up, and some of those reasons aren't only intellectual reasons. And we just have to be patient with ourselves and grace-filled with our own selves as we seek to find responses, thoughtful responses and answers to these questions.
The cultural tide may feel like it's pulling away from Christian faith, but that doesn't mean genuine questions and doubts should be ignored. Whether you are a firm believer or wrestling with uncertainties, our But What About series tackles the tough questions head on. I'm Bill Gorman, campus pastor at the Brookside campus. My co-host Paul Brandis is on sabbatical, so you'll be getting to hear from some other guest hosts in the season. This week, I'm joined by Ben Beasley, interim campus pastor at the Leawood Campus. Now, Ben brings both scholarly and pastoral perspectives to the table in this conversation as we, in this episode, explore not only our personal but whatabouts, but also our hopes that we have for how this series will impact our church community. Ben has a Master of Divinity from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and served as a pastoral resident at our downtown campus. After the residency, he joined Christ Community staff as an associate pastor, again at our downtown campus. Ben then earned a Master of Theology from Princeton Theological Seminary before returning to Christ Community to serve as the interim campus pastor at our Leawood campus. It was such a joy to have this conversation with him, so let's dive in right now. Ben, it's so great to get to have this conversation with you today.
Yeah, you too, Bill. Thanks for inviting me in.
Yeah, this is great. Well, we are in this conversation kind of introducing this new sermon series that we're embarking on. We're calling it But What About? And we want to consider some of the questions that we as followers of Jesus certainly have, as well as that we are, talking with our neighbors, our coworkers about. And I think whether we've followed Jesus for a long time, maybe where they're in a season of considering Jesus for the first time, and certainly I know for a lot of us too, just in a season of deconstruction or wondering, we ask, well, but what about this? But what about the Bible? Or what about these kinds of things? And so we wanted to take a sermon series just as an opportunity to address a few of those but what about kind of questions. And so I thought as we had this conversation, it would be great to hear from you, Ben, just as we start. What have been some of your but what about questions as you've followed Jesus in your journey?
Yeah, it's a good question, Bill, and maybe I'll share a bit about my personality even to begin. But I think I'm a question asker. Like I really don't shy away from the hard questions, and sometimes that leads you down uncomfortable rabbit trails. But it's been also really good for me in my own personal development and spiritual development. I think that trait has been really good. In my college years, when Jesus really became Lord over my life, I think there was a moment really that God transitioned or shifted my intellectual interest to theology as a way to address those real questions that I had surrounding faith, and that maybe previously I felt like I was getting some platitudes or some trite answers about really complex questions. And that I've been really grateful for the Lord, and that He's kind of given me that interest to seek answers to these questions or responses and to dig really deeply there. I think it's helped me as a pastor. For my own personal questions and wrestling, I've really wrestled with, I think in seminary, the idea of hell, the reality of hell, that God has perhaps created people in His own image and only to condemn them to eternal punishment. That reality is a bit shocking when taken at face value. Yeah. And then also the philosophical question: if the highest good I can think of is all people being reconciled back to God, then why wouldn't that be the good that God also desires? That own inner personal question or feeling even. I've wrestled with that. I think I've also wrestled with suffering, but not as much like the theodicy question, more of just what does it mean to be a faithful Christian and go through suffering? What does that look like? Does it look like just what is the emotional life of a faithful Christian who is going through suffering? What does that mean? What does that look like? I think I've wrestled with that even pastorally. I also, in part of my own Christian development, I was in a place in a Christian community that really valued and really heightened like prophecy, healings, things like that. My time at Trinity, where we both did graduate work, was really helpful in finding a rootedness in Scripture, which allowed for me to then place the gifts of the Spirit within the world of the Bible, and also within kind of a life of a Christian. That was really, I think, a helpful ordering for that for me. And I really needed that. So, but those things take time. It takes time to reconcile those questions, and it's been a journey for me. How about you, Bill? What are questions that you've wrestled with or doubts that you've had?
Yeah, no, those ones you've named, I think, are certainly ones I've felt over the years, and some of the ones, suffering and hell in particular, we're going to address. I'm actually excited. We're going to have Dr. Netland, who's a professor at Trinity, specifically on the podcast later to talk about kind of the exclusivity of Jesus, questions about hell. Amazing. I don't know if you had a chance to have classes with him, but
he was my advisor.
Okay, well, I love Dr. Netland and reached out to him, so that's we can look forward to that conversation with him on some of those questions. I think for me, it's interesting you named kind of that college, high school period of time and coming to follow Jesus more intentionally and fully. And similar in my own life. And I think one of the things I started reading, I was probably my senior year of high school, Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. And actually what I discovered in reading that was in that book, I found answers to questions I think I didn't have the courage to ask. And I think that I don't know that anyone in my church community or my family said you shouldn't have questions. You don't do that. But somehow I picked up a sense of like, you shouldn't ask some of these kind of questions.
Yes.
And so
right. Yep.
And again, I had a great family, great church community. So I don't think that was intentional, but somehow I had the sense I shouldn't ask some of these kind of questions. So when I started reading Lewis, it was a bit of a breath of fresh air, both because, someone is answering or, asking these questions as well as providing some answers to them that were helpful to me at the time, certainly, and continue to be so. That's
a heavy, intense book to read as a senior in high school.
Oh, man.
That's impressive.
I had a small group leader in high school who he was so good at asking these kind of questions and just handed that book to me. And we had so many, I'm so grateful for him and introducing that to me. And so I actually then remember reading it again after college and understanding a lot more of it. It was a stretch as a senior in high school.
But so what a gift in a vulnerable point of your spiritual formation, to have been given that book and then been, have someone who's older walk you through that book. Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah. So I think some of the questions that I've had over the years are just questions about the Bible in particular. Like, can we trust it? And, is it... it was as evangelical Christians in the EFC, we have a very high view of Scripture, of the inerrant, inspired Word of God, and what does that mean? And just at times, as I've been confronted with, people who are skeptics and point these things out in the Bible and that kind of thing, it's like, oh man, like, I treasure and love this book, but it's easy to. I think for people to kind of cast aspersion on it and not necessarily always felt like I had like, a great answer or a great response to particular critiques about how the canon came together and all those kinds of things. So that's been one. And certainly the category of just suffering in the world broadly. And I think for me, that one's come more as a pastor as I've walked with others and looked at the suffering that they've experienced. And they've asked questions like, how could God allow something like this in my life or the life of my friend or my child? And so wanting to just give like this really satisfactory answer to that question, but feeling like I don't know if I can give an answer that is satisfying. So I think those are two that have really kind of been ones that have kind of been those back of the mind, but what about questions for me? And we are going to try to tackle those in the series. So I'm just curious then, as we think about, okay, these are some of the questions we have, but like, how do we wrestle with these kind of doubts in our faith journey? Where do we turn? How do we work through them? what would we encourage others to do when they are facing these kind of, man, but what about this? I just don't know. Yep. And so I'm curious, Ben, as you've worked through some of those things, what's that journey been like? And I appreciated earlier you named it takes time.
Yeah.
Often just sitting with the questions, maybe, and time like not like a week, but maybe like a year or 2 or 3.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
But beyond just taking the time, what else would you add to like, how do we work through these things? What do we do? Where do we turn when they come up?
Yep. Well, it's another good question. Bill, I just want to name that we've had the privilege of like extended theological education.
Yes.
And that's like a great gift that we've been given, and space to wrestle with a lot of these things. Like I was working a part-time job while in seminary, but still that provides a lot of space to be able to do that. And also allows for, I think, a groundedness and a framework that has really given me an approach to a lot of these questions that I'm grateful for, and in a gospel-centered approach to these questions. I'd say you named the time piece. I think patience. Like it is like we have to be patient with ourselves and with others when we're asking these questions.
That's right.
So we want to be patient with ourselves, because there's a lot of reasons we can be asking these questions at different points in our lives. These questions will bubble up, and some of those reasons aren't only intellectual reasons.
That's right.
And we just have to be patient with ourselves and grace-filled with our own selves as we seek to find responses, thoughtful responses and answers to these questions. I think exercising charity with others who are asking these questions, some questions that people ask, and maybe, Bill, even you've been in these conversations where it can make you uncomfortable because you don't have an answer right off the bat. Yeah. And we just have to be honest in those moments that, hey, I don't have the answer to this off the top of my head or right now. And but also just to extend charity for people asking difficult questions and who are going to be on a journey seeking to find a response to that question. So I think patience and charity are kind of maybe the foundational pieces that I think are really important. I'd also say, this is a big kind of word, but like epistemological humility of knowing that like you have your own limits. Yeah. Both time, but also our own capacity to find our answers to these questions. And what I mean by that is like just a sense of like, hey, none of these questions are new. Often a lot of these questions are not new questions, and a lot of people have been wrestling with them. And so for people in an Orthodox space too, it's like we can trust that there's been Christians going before who've really wrestled thoughtfully with a lot of these questions, and seek out those thoughtful Christians who have done that work and look for those resources. I think that's really important. And then the last piece would be, and I mentioned this a little bit before, but I recently have been reading a book called The Spirituality of the Psalms by Walter Brueggemann, who he divides the Psalms. Maybe you've probably read this, Bill. What haven't you read? But he divides the Psalms into 3 different categories: orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. And he models, and he kind of like parallels that to our own seasons of life. Like there's times where we experience disorientation with God, with job, with however our life looks. And there's a place of like reorientation that will come later. And so maybe to like tie everything together in some way, but like to be in seasons of disorientation, like really to trust ourselves to God in prayer and surrender as we seek to be reoriented to Him in a way that feels like we're aligning our spirit and our own selves with Him. I think we just have to be another word, same word, patient during those times. What do you have to say about that, Bill? Like when you've wrestled with these kind of doubts, where do you turn? How do you work through them? What are your resources, your go-tos, if you have them?
Yeah. I think a community of people is so important to not wrestle with those things alone, and to be able to have, I think there's a certain amount of even maybe some shame that can come with questioning, and there's like shame just loves to hide. And I think the moment that we can bring other people in and say, I'm having a hard time with this. Even that act of talking with a like a trusted friend or your community group or a pastor or whatever about those questions, just in themselves can sometimes just the act of naming that, verbalizing that, having a conversation is so important. We weren't ever intended to follow Jesus alone or to wrestle with these kind of questions alone. I think I'm encouraged too that even in the New Testament, like people struggle with Jesus or the resurrection, or, in Book of Jude talks about have mercy on those who doubt. I think it's, Alistair McGrath is a theologian who I enjoy reading, but he's got a little book on doubt. And I love that he says, doubt is asking questions from the standpoint of faith, which versus, unbelief, which is this kind of considered choice not to believe in something. And so I think even just having a category for asking these kind of questions as a part of our faith journey in a community is really important. So I think that community piece is really vital. I think sometimes our tendency can be to want to isolate in those moments and just hang out on YouTube or Wikipedia or whatever. And those are all great resources. But having a conversation with people who are actually like in the flesh with you, who know you, who love you, who can ask questions back of you, point you to resources that you may not know about, that Google might not feed you on a search, is so important, I think. So that community piece is really big. I do love, you mentioned this idea of epistemic humility, epistemology is like, how do we know things? And, one of the things we've talked a lot about at Christ Community over the years is having a humble confidence versus a dogmatic certainty. And I think one of the issues that we face kind of in late modernity is this kind of sense that if we just work hard enough, we can get to like absolute certainty. And that I think that quest for certitude actually can undermine our faith. And so I think actually changing a little bit of what our expectation is, even as we're asking these questions about the kind of answer or the level of certitude we might have, to say, I want to have a humble confidence. I can be confident. We can gain confidence around these answers. We hold that with humility. Tom talks about this, that our Christian faith is ultimately, it can be questioned, but it can't be, like, it's unsurpassable. It's not unassailable. Like people can put genuinely difficult questions that assail Christian faith, but the person of Jesus is sort of unsurpassable in who he is. And so I think that kind of goes along with just what is the expectation that I have of the kind of answer or the kind of certainty that I'm going to get to my questions.
Yeah, that's really good, Bill. I think just about doubt being an important part of our Christian formation, even, or wrestling with these questions being an important part of our Christian formation, like even the word Israel in Hebrew is to wrestle with God.
Yes, that's
There's a sense where God names his people, a community of people, after this idea of wrestling with him, which comes from the night when God and Jacob wrestled together. So this is an important piece of what it means to be Christian.
Which I think is even a distinction and a little bit of a way from, between Christianity and Islam, where Islam, there's just this kind of idea of submit to Allah in this kind of absolute kind of unquestioned sort of way. But God has created us in his image for relationship. And so he invites these questions and these wrestlings. I mean, you just see that in his relationship with his people. And so I think there's a beauty in the fact that we're made in God's image for relationship with him. And any relationship involves kind of at times questioning or doubt or wrestling, maybe in the broadest kind of sense. I'm actually recently been working through a book called After Doubt by an author, A.J. Swoboda. He's a professor out in Portland. And it's been really helpful. So we'll put a link to that in the show notes too, just on kind of helping us think about how do you address some of these kinds of questions, and what are where do they come from, and what do we do, and what is the role of doubt in spiritual formation in our journey?
Oh yeah, sounds like a great read, Bill. That's awesome. Really Bill, you've led out in architecting this series. Can you tell us what topics we're going to be addressing and what our hopes are for addressing these topics?
Yeah. So we kind of, as a team together, campus pastors, senior pastors, as well as, we bring this to the elders and that kind of thing. We brought a bunch of different questions because there's a bunch of different ones we could ask, but we're going to limit ourselves to 7 weeks of this series. So, or the 7 that we want to address. And so, hopefully, these will be a good kind of representation of the questions. I even did a little survey work in our Church for Monday class, asking some of our participants, what are some of your but what abouts? And
yes,
trying to field those from our congregation. So after we did some of that work, we narrowed it down to these 7 questions. We are saying, but what about the church? So I think the church itself has been sometimes an obstacle or a barrier to people as they look at what they maybe see as hypocrisy or leadership failures or abuse in the church, all these kinds of things. Yes. There's people. So just what about the church? And then another one there is, but what about the Bible? I think we all have questions about the Bible. How did it come together? And can we trust it? And translations, and are they reliable? And all that kind of thing. So the church, the Bible. I think another big one for many is, but what about how the church has treated women and viewed women over the years, especially in other kind of seasons and eras and cultures of the church. And so how does Jesus think about women? How ought the church to think about women? And so that's one we're going to look at. Another one, I think this is probably one of the biggest in our cultural moment, is just Christian sexual ethics. And that the Christian sexual ethic is increasingly implausible, maybe at best, and maybe seen as oppressive or harmful at worst. And so we want to take a look at that. And so that's another one. And then politics, Christianity and politics. And again, I think that's another space where oftentimes people have viewed the church really negatively. I say, but man, I'm interested in Jesus, but the way that the church is engaged politically just totally turns me off. And so, what is God's design for human government, and how do we think about that, interact with that? So that's another one. Then suffering and hell, which we've already mentioned, are 2 other ones we want to talk about that. So I think my hope, as we look at each one of those tough but what about questions, is that we would increasingly, as a community of faith, not only see Jesus as the true way, and that's important, like questions of truth, and you got to start there, but that we would come to see him and the church as truly good and beautiful. I think in past generations, the question of truth, is this true, was really important. I think in our current cultural moment, people want to know, is this true? But also, is it good? Is it beautiful? Does it lead to a beautiful kind of life? So that's what I hope that we get to in these sermons each week. Not only hear some truth to respond to some of these questions, but also a vision of human flourishing and goodness and beauty. Yeah,
that's awesome, Bill. Just going off of maybe what you said a little bit earlier too, this humble confidence piece. I think that'd be another one too that we'd be hoping for, right? That people grow in a humble confidence that they can trust the Bible, that they can lean into Jesus instead of away from Jesus. You know, we can have a humble confidence in our Christian faith and what we believe. It's not unassailable, but Jesus is unsurpassable. Ben, humble confidence for you? What are some other hopes that you might have as you've thought about this series and the messages? There's so much there as you're going through it, right? There's so much there.
Pray for us.
Absolutely. I hope and pray that we model in a healthy way what it looks like to address these tensions and to dig into them. I hope that by the way that we've structured this series and we're engaging the questions, we're also modeling what it looks like to engage these questions in a way that leads toward Jesus, instead of away from Jesus. So I hope that, and also that we use the Bible as a way to resolve those tensions too. So that would be a hope, I think, as well.
Absolutely. Well, and I there's so many resources. We're going to try to really put a lot of resources out on each one of these messages, whether that's follow-up, books or videos or anything, with each sermon. Hopefully there'll be, lots of ways that you can follow up. But I was even thinking too, just if you're listening to this and you're thinking about getting ready for this series and what resources that you might want to look at. There's a few books certainly that I've been going back to as we've prepared for this series. One of those is certainly Tim Keller's The Reason for God is a classic in that space. We've mentioned Mere Christianity already. Rebecca McLaughlin's book, Questioning or Confronting Christianity, 12 Hard Questions for the World's Largest Religion, is outstanding. So we'll put some of the links to those resources in the show notes. Awesome. And even if you just Google those authors, you can find them on YouTube if you like doing that, or podcasts. But those are some great resources and they have questions in there that we're not going to get to touch on in this series that we just for time and length won't be able to do. So I would just encourage you to check those out as we think about engaging this series and as we journey along in it. So as we wrap up a little bit here, Ben, we always like to ask our guests a final question. This is your first time being on the podcast, so I'm going to ask it to you. And that is, if you could do something else besides this amazing work that you do as a pastor at the Leawood Campus, what would you do? So my answer to that question is always, I'd be a National Park Service ranger, or I also would love to be a research librarian.
Oh my gosh.
Hang out in the library, help people do their research. But what would you do, Ben?
Yeah, maybe the opposite of a national park. Like, I'd be holed up in a small apartment and just be like a writer or poet.
Okay, I thought you were going to be like
pennies.
Cutting down trees and destroying the forest. No, okay.
Or just probably holed up in some small apartment. Yeah, selling my poetry for pennies.
Yes, I love it.
To whoever wants to buy it. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, I have like a romantic vision, I think, in my head still about that. But,
yes. Oh, that's so good. That's so good. Well, thanks so much for being a part of this, Ben, this conversation. And I'm excited to get to preach these messages alongside of you and with you at our various campuses. And so, again, you will find links to everything that we've mentioned, those different books and resources in the show notes. So you can follow up on those. And I mentioned already that we'll have a guest to specifically talk about hell and exclusivity of Jesus. We're going to have a number of other special guests on the podcast related to some of these topics. And so just be on the lookout for those in the coming weeks as we dive into this series together.